Dean Stark arrived in the afternoon. I watched as he walked in confidently, lips pressed lightly together. Seeing me, a forced smile appeared on his pale face. "Nikki, are you feeling better?" he asked cautiously. I gently raised my lips, nodded politely, and said, "Yes, much better, thank you." Dean, Wisnovel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. Dean's face became even paler, his lips moved slightly as if wanting to say something, but in the end, he stopped at the corner of his mouth. "That's good," he murmured. His lowered gaze trembled slightly. As we sat and stood, one looking up and the other looking down, he dared not look at me again. Memories of Dean Stark seemed to flood back to me. Although just a faint memory, it should have been our first meeting. In the bar, he was drunk. I stood not far from him, watching him for a long time, my whole body trembling. I heard myself say, "Don't be like this, please, don't be like this." At that time, my face was even paler than Dean's now, as if fate had dealt me a heavy blow. How did Dean respond? Let me think. Oh, I remember now. His handsome face was full of disgust. He pushed me away with one hand, who tried to stop him from drinking, and said, contemptuously, "Where did this whore come from? Get lost." I fell to the ground, looking so desperate. At that time, Ronald was not by my side. I woke up from the memory, looking at Dean in confusion. He was so different from the arrogant man in my memory, but that face still indicated that it was him. How could someone like him be a friend? Filled with confusion, I asked, "Dean, are we really?" I hesitated for a moment, organized my words, and asked, "Are we really friends?" Upon hearing this, Dean trembled, not daring to move. He kept his head low, like a mud figurine standing there. I had a strange illusion that if given the chance, Dean would definitely hide in the shadows and conceal himself. A tall, handsome man in a suit now looked like a panicked child, at a loss. He opened his lips, but closed them again. There was a struggle in Dean's eyes, and after a while, a breeze finally woke him up. The wind carried the scent of eustoma, like a distant yearning, also like a warm embrace. I turned to look outside at the brilliant scenery, feeling somewhat sad for some reason. Following my gaze, Dean looked outside the window. After a moment of silence, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, as if recalling a beautiful memory. His voice was slightly hoarse, tinged with nostalgia as he said, "You planted those." After a pause, he added, "It took 2 days to plant them." He looked at me, nervously asking, "Do you know the meaning of its flowers?" Of course, I knew, but before I could answer, Dean answered himself. Perhaps he thought I had amnesia and had forgotten everything. With a certain anticipation, he said, "The eustoma's flower language is declaration of true love." I looked at him in astonishment, seeing the indescribable emotions in his eyes. Did Dean like me? It's strange. I was actually so surprised in my heart. I shook my head at him, denying, "No, it's undying longing." The light in Dean's eyes shattered. The barely perceptible smile disappeared. I didn't look at Dean again. I pushed the wheelchair to the study on my own. He silently followed behind me, a corner of an old phone peeking out of his pocket. I glanced at it, turning my head in confusion. He really didn't seem like a nostalgic person. I was surprised by Dean's arrival. He was like those fragments of memories, always bursting in unexpectedly, and each memory was not too pleasant. Before I saw that patch of eustoma, there were roses planted in the yard. Dean went crazy and pulled them all out. He had a big argument with me at that time, his face dark and terrifying. His fair and slender hands were covered in scars and dripping with blood from the rose thorns. What was I doing at that time? I seemed tired, bowing my head in silence. "Dean, don't be angry," I heard myself tiredly say. "Are roses beautiful?" Dean asked coldly. I raised my eyes to look at him, his eyes clean without any impurities, surprisingly devoid of any extra emotions. "Why are you angry?" I asked, puzzled. Dean looked at me coldly, his eyes filled with more and more anger. As if the more indifferent I was, the closer he was to the brink of collapse. "Nikki, do you really?" He suddenly softened his tone and walked towards me. His face became gentle and affectionate, his hands dripping with red liquid caressing my cheek. I saw him getting closer and closer to me. His face stopped right in front of my nose. Our breaths intertwined, almost palpable. His eyes were full of madness. I always felt that if he went to hell, he wouldn't spare me. "Nikki, you must not like anyone else." I heard his deep voice in my ear. The chill in his tone sent shivers down my spine. The rose was ravaged and withered, bare. Especially Asa Stark, he warned through gritted teeth in my ear. But in a moment, his expression changed again. He spoke softly, "How about we plant the flowers you like?" I looked up seriously at his expression, wondering if he was going crazy again. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and unclear. I smiled. "Then let's plant eustoma," I said. A little later in the evening, a visitor arrived at the villa uninvited. I didn't mind, but Dean's expression was grim. Rena stood by my side, looking wary towards the man. He was a man. His face bore some resemblance to Dean's. Sure enough, the next moment, I heard Dean coldly ask, "Asa Stark, what are you here for?" So they were brothers. Asa glanced at me with a smirk and chuckled. "Of course, I'm here to see Nikki. Why else would I come to see you?" Asa looked around the villa and clicked his tongue. "Nikki never lived here before. How come? Just one trip to the hospital and you fell in love with her?" He looked at me curiously curiously and asked, Nikki, don't you mind him leaving you alone in the mountains for Sarah? Asa seemed unpleasant, but towards me, he seemed to have some sympathy. I looked up and observed Dean's expression. His fists were clenched, eyes filled with fear. What was he afraid of? Afraid that I would know the truth? Or afraid that I would leave? These thoughts surfaced briefly, then I pushed them down. I surprised myself with how self-absorbed I was. To think that Dean, who was usually so cold towards me, would be afraid of losing me. I have amnesia, I said calmly, so I don't understand what you're saying. Asa raised an eyebrow, a hint of playfulness in his eyes. He glanced at me, then at the lonely figure of Dean, and couldn't help but laugh. Dean, you're really pitiful, he sneered sharply. Nikki now doesn't care about you at all, he said each word clearly and distinctly. Dean didn't retort. His face looked defeated and desolate, but in an instant, his broad shoulders suddenly relaxed, and his straight posture slightly hunched. His hoarse voice echoed in the spacious living room. Do you have any other business? Asa snorted coldly, then a smile appeared on his face. I'm here to deliver wedding invitations to you both, he said. Sarah and I are finally getting married, a match made in heaven. He looked down at Dean condescendingly and taunted. You used to have Nikki standing up for you against me. Now, he shrugged, smiling, my good brother, you have nothing left. He seemed to be in a good mood, his smile carrying a hint of provocation. Dean kept his head down, ignoring him. Perhaps feeling bored, Asa shrugged and prepared to leave. It seemed like he came just to mock Dean. Just as he was about to step out of the door, he suddenly noticed the eustoma in the yard, and the smile on his face deepened. Nikki, he turned and affectionately called my name. I looked up at him. He winked at me and asked, did you like the roses I sent you last time? Dean covered his face in despair, and soon, crystal tears fell to the floor with a plop. Asa had achieved his goal and left humming a tune. The roar of the sports car echoed in the quiet evening, gradually fading away. The pieces in my mind connected. Oh, so that's why. Dean almost came to the place where I lived every day. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, sometimes his shoulders were wet with morning dew. He never rang the doorbell, always quietly. I asked Rena why he did this. Rena lowered her eyes, smiled lightly, and said with a hint of sarcasm, he's probably learning to be a little fool. I couldn't quite read the expression on her face, it was so faint, but I inexplicably felt her disdain for Dean. And that little fool she mentioned might be me. My past was like a growing fog. I was immersed in it, only able to see the time with Ronald. As for Dean, there was not a trace left. Rena bent down, tears shimmering in her eyes as she said, Nikki, I hope you don't remember. It would be better that way. But I also hope you remember. Don't forget. Forget who? Or forget. Rena wouldn't tell me. I knew. She just quietly looked out the window, with a sad expression, as if wanting to bear my sadness as well. I touched my heart, feeling a dull ache. Rena, I called her name softly. She suddenly snapped out of it, her lips curved into a smile again. How did we meet? I asked, curiously. Since waking up, she had said she was my best friend, but she never mentioned our past. Rena's face visibly froze. Her trembling hand seemed to be covering something, quickly placed it on my wheelchair. With force, turning pale. We met in college, and hit it off right away. She dared not look into my eyes, and said directly. I stared at her tightly clenched lower lip, sighed, and lowered my head. This lie was just too clumsy. A light breeze brushed past, blowing the white curtains of the French windows, revealing the eustoma in the yard, and Dean's car. When did he come? Rena also noticed, frowned slightly, and went to open the door. Not long after, Dean followed her in. Dean, good morning, I politely smiled. The way we greeted each other was very formal. Dean raised the corner of his mouth, showing an awkward smile. Nikki, good morning, he said. It was strange that since I woke up, the three of us had never genuinely smiled at each other. Have you had breakfast? The words almost slipped out subconsciously. Even I was a bit surprised. Dean curled his fingers on the edge of his pants, pursed his lips, as if he remembered something, his eyes reddening. I did, his voice hoarse. For some reason, his voice seemed choked up. I politely avoided looking at him, but deep down, I had a feeling that I might have asked him if he had eaten 1,000 times before. But the answers I used to get were completely different from today. After my body recovered, I no longer needed the wheelchair. Coincidentally, my brother's birthday was approaching. I planned to go to the mall to buy some yarn and knit a sweater for him. It's only summer, winter is still far away, Rena joked with me. I smiled and felt a little embarrassed. Yarn is cheaper in the summer, I chuckled. Back in high school, money was tight and winter clothes were expensive. Ronald always bought the best scarves, sweaters, coats, hats, and gloves for me, but never for himself. Feeling sorry, I bought yarn and followed online tutorials to knit for him. The first piece was simply atrocious, but Ronald still happily wore it. Later, every winter outfit he had was knitted by me. That's how we spent 3 cold winters. What about after going to college? How did Ronald get by? I lowered my eyes, feeling a bit sad. My mind was blank. missing the most important person. Rena took me to the nearest mall. Luxurious bright lights and a dazzling array of goods. Each item was more expensive than I expected, even though I had money. Yes, that was also something I couldn't figure out after waking up. I had just graduated a year ago. I should have been broke, but I had a bank card with 5 million in it. But when I held it, there was no joy, only resistance. A kind of resistance that wanted it to disappear. Nikki, let's go to the second floor, Rena said warmly. I nodded and followed her to the second floor. But while waiting for the elevator, someone called out to me. Nikki Phillips? A hesitant voice came from behind me. I turned to look. It was two women. Their uncertain eyes became certain when they saw my face. It's really you? The woman in the pink dress said condescendingly. The woman beside her, dressed elegantly and gracefully, pulled her back. Then she looked at me gently and said, I'm Sarah, and she's Caitlin. We're Dean's friends, she said. She stared straight at me, as if expecting a certain reaction. I frowned and slowly said, oh, what's with your attitude? Seeing my indifference, Caitlin looked enraged. Her mouth started firing questions like a machine gun. Nikki, what are you pretending? How can you act like you've forgotten and pretend that thing never happened? Curious, I asked. What thing? Caitlin was stunned for a moment. After a while, she snorted and said, it's despicable of you to act as Dean's lackey. I found her incomprehensible, taking so long to get to the point, and began to feel a bit impatient. What exactly happened? Caitlin widened her eyes and angrily said, it's about you pushing Sarah down the mountain. I simply couldn't believe I would do such a thing. You're lying, I said. You don't admit it? Caitlin stood with her hands on her hips, looking like a warrior charging into battle for someone else. I shook my head, firmly denying I wouldn't do such a thing. Sarah smiled, but it was a strained smile. Caitlin, let it go. She held Caitlin's hand, as if she had suffered a great injustice, and could only swallow her tears. Oh, why is she like this? Making it seem like I really did it. Can you two explain clearly what happened? I couldn't bear it any longer and asked. Caitlin comfortingly patted Sarah's hand, looking fierce. It's because you pestered Dean to celebrate your birthday, insisting on climbing Spirit Mountain. When Sarah found out, she organized everyone to celebrate your birthday together. But you, Sarah was talking to you, but you, out of jealousy for how Dean treats her well, pushed her down the mountain. If it weren't for a tree blocking her, you would be in prison by now. You still owe Sarah an apology, understand? I pursed my lips, seeing that they seemed serious, and couldn't make up my mind for a moment. After all that, all they wanted was an apology. Could it be that I've really become so bad? Then why didn't you send me to prison? I asked in confusion. Caitlin and Sarah visibly hesitated. After a while, Caitlin spoke awkwardly. Because we saw you were hospitalized and couldn't be bothered to argue with you. No, my birthday was over a month ago. So, I pondered, I was hospitalized on my birthday? I frowned and asked coldly, turning to Rena. She had an unusually pale face. Her fair hands began to tremble gradually. Rena pleaded with me, saying, Nikki, don't believe her. But before she could say anything else, Caitlin interjected. You were hospitalized the day after your birthday. We didn't know you had a heart transplant surgery and thought you could come down the mountain on your own. A roar sounded in my head. I almost couldn't stand, my eyes filled with confusion. Heart transplant? I muttered. Rena held my trembling hand. She lowered her head, unable to look at me. Whose heart is it? I realized and tightly squeezed her arm, demanding an answer. Rena, it's not his, right? Tears streamed down my eyes, despair in my gaze. My brother was healthy, and live organ transplants are illegal, so it's not his, right? Rena Collins, you tell me. I choked up. Tears blurred my vision. All I saw was her vigorously shaking her head, her voice trembling with tears. It's not his, Nikki. Your heart is not his. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I heard Rena say in a sorrowful tone, but Ronald, he did indeed pass away. Boom. My spine felt like it had been struck hard. My body went limp, and I lost consciousness completely.